am home alone. Nobody in the house for the rest of the weekend. I have it all to myself. And it's Friday. Got the whole night to myself, Friday night. And so I am going to do what I'm sure any of you would do in this circumstance. I am going to gorge myself on DVDs of George Washington as played by Barry Bostwick. You know, when it comes to movies or TV shows or DVDs or any of these kind of things on the American Revolution, it's pretty slim pickings. Not a lot of things. And I'm not sure why that is, but anything that's out there, I'm likely to watch a few times, even if it isn't the greatest thing in the world. And I'll tell you, this is not the greatest thing in the world, but it's not bad. It really is not bad. And I think those of you out there, those young people who grew up on Sopranos and HBO and television that was good, you're missing out on that joy we used to have when a big-time miniseries would come on. You know, like Rich Man, Poor Man, or whatever, Roots, Shogun. I mean, these things were huge. And they would take over your life, and you would watch these things, and they were on all week, and they were always really exciting, and they usually had the same people. Ed Asner seemed to be in just about every single miniseries ever shown in the 70s. And so you recognize Robert Reed often seemed to show up. A lot of these people showed up a lot of the times, but it was always really exciting, and there was something about the way they really took a lot of these things on pretty seriously. And this is really actually two series of episodes that they did. They first did something on Washington's, they did the first half of his life, or the beginning of his life in the military, and then they do him as we become a country, and he becomes the president. And these are based on the James Flexner books. I really like the James Flexner books. They may be my favorite. Sometime I'll do a video on them maybe, but Chernow's book is very good. There's some other good books, but I love the multi-volume books. I love the things that really get into it and give you the opportunity to live with the character for a long time, not just hit the top moments, but really go through a life. And so this is probably my favorite book, and they did a good job in terms of trying to deal with some seriousness with every aspect of George Washington's life. Now, of course, you have that kind of embarrassing part where, well, here comes Buddy to join me here. You have that embarrassing part when, say hi, Buddy. There she is. Say hi. You have that embarrassing part when you have the character, you have Barry Bostwick trying to play a teenager, and he's hopping around and doing all of those kind of things, which all these shows seem to always have. But it goes through his situation with his mother, who's the lady who played Mrs. Pynchon in the Lou Grant show. Lays that out pretty well, lays out the beginning of his life pretty well, and tries to show that he's somewhat of an arrogant young man, which he was. You know, whether it's arrogance or just desperation that he felt to really make it, you can determine on your own. But it goes through quite a bit on the French Indian War and him as a young man, and of course it goes into his relationship with Sally Fairfax, because you've got Jacqueline Smith playing Sally Fairfax. Yeah, Jacqueline Smith. And some of those scenes are painful. There's this thing with her and the fan. Those of you who have seen it remember it, where she says, "You have not learned the lessons of the fan. You have not learned the language of a fan and what a fan means." And, you know, there's a lot of kind of silliness in there. And she doesn't get to come off pretty well. But anyway, Patty Duke plays Martha Washington, and I think she actually does a very good job. I think people are very unfair about Martha Washington, because the picture we usually get of her, she's about 150 years old, but she was not 150 years old when she married George. Anyway, the battles, you get into the series of battles, and it gets a little bit run on because you just have battle after battle after battle. But to me, it's exciting because a lot of these battles I do tours on. So I wanted to see their interpretation of the Battle of Trenton, and I like to see their interpretation. They didn't really do Brandywine. They don't like to do battles that he loses. But the thing that I would say it's worthwhile about this is that I think Barry Bostwick does a good job. Which is a very, George Washington's a hard part. It's a very, very hard part. You have to, there's a video at Valley Forge where somebody plays George Washington, and it's just absolutely painful because he's too old for one thing, he's too fat, but he's also the most boring, pompous person you're ever going to meet. And that's not George Washington. People wouldn't have been that interested in George Washington if it had been. But you have to, if you're going to play George Washington, the guy's got to be impressive. He's got to be quiet. He's got to be reserved and serious. But you have to have a part of him that you can believe people would follow and people would respect. And I think, as I say, Bostwick does a pretty good job on that. I think he does a pretty good job. I haven't gotten through more of that as I'm watching it this time, but I've watched this a few times. The presidential years are done fairly well. Of course, you always have the issues that you always have with all of these, and even with the books, which the people tend to take a point of view, so that if you like Washington, you have to put down Jefferson, and that's just kind of a real problem with scholarship, as well as with these movies often have. But at the end of the day, people don't know anything about George Washington. They really don't. And I spent a lot of my time on my tours trying to bridge that gap and talk to people about George Washington. But I would say that this is a pretty good series. It does pretty well. I think he plays his role pretty well. Now, the award for worst actor is the kid who plays his stepson. Oh my God, it's painful. But for the most part, it gives a fairly good understanding of George Washington, and it gives a fairly good understanding of the times. It has a lot of very good actors in it, and all in all, it's worth showing your family. It's worth showing your kids if they're going into school and they're hitting American history, or they haven't hit American history yet. It's going to be up to all of us parents to teach our kids a lot of these things. History is becoming less and less and less and less important in the curriculum, and we have to make it a part of life. And if you've got young kids, I would say buy this DVD. I'm sure it doesn't cost very much, and let them watch it. It's pretty good. It's pretty correct. Now, there's sometimes it's just a little bit ridiculous, like how it handles Ona Judge. Of course, Ona Judge is the slave of George Washington's who escaped from Philadelphia, made it out to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and George Washington makes several attempts really, to capture her and send her back to Virginia, which is illegal. There's this thing called the Fugitive Slave Act, but Washington and slavery is a very complicated subject. There have been a few books written on it. He definitely doesn't come out the worst of the characters that we look at. But there's times he fails us. There's times he disappoints us. And you just have to accept that Washington in general was on a positive trajectory in his later years, and at the end of the day, he's going to free those slaves that he can, that he owns. Can't free Martha's slaves because he had only a life interest. And of course, there's a couple ways you can look at that. One is he's particularly situated to free slaves because he knows his wife is still going to have slaves because there's slaves he can't free. He also doesn't have any children to worry about. So it's easier for him to do it than it is for anybody else. But I think people don't give the credit deserved for the fact that he freed the slaves that he could free in his will. I really think that's his last words to the American people. I think he's telling the American people something fundamental and important, that this thing has to end. Slavery has to end. And he's going to take an action that's going to make that argument that slavery has to end. And a lot of young people especially say, oh, big deal, he chickened out. Why didn't he do it when he was younger, when he was alive? Why did he wait till he was dead? Well, he did chicken out. I mean, frankly, he had no interest in creating a large controversy about that when he was alive. He had no interest in offending and upsetting his Virginia neighbors and relatives, and he did struggle with it, though. It's something that he wrote about and that he thought about, and he certainly acknowledged that slavery was an evil that had to end. Now, they all said that. Jefferson said that. Madison, they all said that. But he, more than any of the others, took actions to free his slaves. But, you know, in the miniseries, his concern is only about Ona and that she was seduced by a Frenchman, which is just kind of this ridiculous story that he came up with, and nobody knows how he came up with this theory. But that's you know, that's what you're going to get with these things a lot of the time. You know, he comes across as almost very heroic on the issue of slavery. At one point, slaves are being dragged out, and he runs up and yells at his assistant that I'm not breaking up families, and that was generally his position. He didn't want to break up families, but on the other hand, he could be tough on slaves. You know, one of the things that aggravated him about slavery was that slaves didn't want to work very hard if he wasn't standing there watching them. And at some point, he reaches the understanding that it's just kind of an illogical creation, because if you're not offered incentives for doing good work, you're not going to do good work. And so part of his problem with slavery was that it wasn't pragmatic. It wasn't an efficient way to try to get things done, because he would measure how much work slaves did when he was there, and he would measure how much work they did when he wasn't there. He wasn't the worst slave owner in the world, but you know, there's a story where this one guy had broken an arm, and he said, "Well, I can't work." And Washington picked up a rake and started raking. He says, "Look at this! I can do this with one arm," and he puts the other arm behind himself. So, you know, the Washington and slavery discussion can go on, but you are going to notice that he's been put into a positive light in this show. But you know, the real sad thing is, because he had slaves, probably we're not going to get another program about him. You know, I had really hoped that when Chernow's very good book on Washington was published, that maybe HBO would do a series on George Washington. And I just think, you know, the same kind of thing they did with John Adams, which sometime I'll talk to you about that miniseries. And I really hoped that they would do that. But I don't think they will do that, because I think people will picket, and people will say, you know, you shouldn't be doing a series about a slave owner. You know, in Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, they took down the plaque saying George Washington sat here. It didn't say anything else. It didn't say anything about George Washington. It didn't even aggrandize him. It just said he sat here, and they took it down and said this is going to offend people. You know, if we're going to be citizens of this country, if we're going to be valuable citizens, and we're going to vote, and we're going to participate, we need to know our history. Obviously, I believe that. I've dedicated my life to trying to teach the history, to trying to proselytize about the history. And that doesn't mean glorifying things that aren't glorious. That doesn't mean lying about people. That doesn't mean hiding people's defects. Any serious look at George Washington, especially in this day and age, is also going to look at the issue of slavery. But what it doesn't mean is ignoring history and just not discussing history. And I'm pretty concerned that that's the direction we're going in. So at any rate, I'm not expecting any HBO series on Chernow's book about George Washington. Don't think it's going to happen. We can have a movie on Lincoln. We can have a series on Adams. But we're probably not going to have one on George Washington. So we're left with Barry Bostwick. So anyway, if you do have young kids in the home, I think this is something that maybe you might want to watch on July 4th weekend, something like that. I think it's a good show. I think it does pretty well. It's not perfect. It has some silly moments. But you know what? You'll learn about George Washington, and I think that's an important thing for people to do. I think he's the one character in the war. He's the one character in the beginning of the country that if you take him out of the story, everything's different. And so we need to know him more than the guy who's on the dollar bill, and we need to know more about him than, you know, on President's Day we have funny pictures of him in places that sell cars. And we need to know more about him than he was the first president of the United States. We need to know these people in order to understand ourselves. And we have to understand that while they are not perfect any more than our own biological parents are perfect, that they put together a pretty complex and really a fascinating system of government, and that we still have things we can learn from them. We have things we can learn from them politically. We have things we can learn from them psychologically. So anyway, go ahead, grab the movie. Buddy and I are going to watch the rest of it tonight, and I encourage you, check it out. Go on to Amazon.com, and I am sure they have some DVDs. And as I say, it's sometimes sold in two different things, because there were actually two different series that were separated by a few years.